Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here at the Atlantic Council for this timely discussion on Europe's strategic outlook on China, co-hosted by the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and the Europe Center. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and I am thrilled to moderate today's event. On April 4th, tomorrow, French President Emmanuel Macron and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen will visit Beijing to project a united front vis-a-vis China. This trip follows a fiery speech by von der Leyen last Thursday, calling for Europe to be bolder on China, arguing that Beijing has become more repressive at home and more assertive abroad. For the first time, von der Leyen also gave hints that the EU could finally end its long-standing efforts to land a major trade agreement with China, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. To talk about these topics today, we have a fantastic panel of some of the best China experts in the game today. First, we have Reinhard Bütikofer, who is a member of the European Parliament and the chair of the Delegation for Relations with the People's Republic of China, representing the Group of the Greens and European Free Alliance. We have Colleen Cottle, who is the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's China Hub here in Washington, D.C. We also have Francois Godement, who is the Senior Advisor for Asia at the Institut Montaigne. To discuss this upcoming visit and dig deeper into the broader strategic relationship today, I think this is the perfect panel of experts, and I'm excited to also bring in some audience questions. So if you're watching this event today, whether it's on Twitter or it's on YouTube, please go ahead and feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function, and we'll be sure to bring those into the conversation. And if you're online, you can follow this conversation at AC Europe, at the Atlantic Council, and at the AC Global China tags on Twitter. So with that, and in the interest of time, given that we only have an hour, we could probably go on for 3 hours, I want to start by going to Reinhard. To give us sort of an overview of the latest happenings on the EU relationship with China. So Reinhard, what stood out to you most from Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's remarks last week? Is this the right direction for Europe? And are there areas that you wish to have seen better addressed? What are your general thoughts?
Thanks, first of all, for having me, Rachel. Great pleasure to be part of this conversation. I would say that Ursula von der Leyen gave a really very remarkable speech. She did not mince any words. She called a spade a spade. She showed a great deal of realism combined with European self-confidence. For instance, she didn't shy back from saying clearly that the days of reform and opening up are over, and that she is now pursuing a policy that is under the headline of security and control. I would say, indeed, she gave a good direction. If Europe could follow up in the same vein, that would be a great achievement. The core phrase or the core concept that she advocated was de-risking. And I think that captures quite well a widely shared European perspective. There's very few people in Europe that would support a decoupling perspective, which does, of course, not exclude that we would close the door to some companies like Huawei for national security reasons, but the overall concept is not to decouple from China. The concept is to keep developing the relationship, but to make sure that we are not on the losing side, and de-risking is a good concept, I think, that she can build on, and that we all can build on. I hardly found a lot to be criticized. Of course, she could have dwelled more on Taiwan, probably, but I have not yet heard a European or any other leader speaking so clearly and with such a high level of a willingness to not sort of avoid addressing difficult issues. She, for instance, also clearly spelled out that she is not all that in favor of still reviving the so-called comprehensive agreement on investment, which several national leaders have been trying to peddle recently. I'm not saying that everybody has been full of praise, but I would indeed praise her for that speech. That was a leader's speech.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that America has been hoping for quite some time. We've been pushing Europe in many ways to be more forward leaning on China. And I think that this speech represented a lot of what we have been looking for and hoping for. Francois, I'd like to come to you next. You know, as much as tomorrow's visit is about the EU-China relationship, it's as much about France's China strategy with the visit initiated under President Macron's lead. So what are France's priorities in particular when it comes to China and strategic competition? And how do you think those priorities fit alongside the vision that von der Leyen articulated last week?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for the invitation to speak to your audience. First of all, it's important to note that President Macron is probably at the origin of the invitation by the Chinese to von der Leyen. She needed the invitation to go there, of course, but it's a joint trip. And this is probably the first French president who puts Europe so high in his practical agenda. Of course, it may also mean an indirect and unspoken swipe at Chancellor Scholz, whose visit in October with essentially German businessman for 24 hours didn't look very European. But I think, and today Macron and von der Leyen are meeting in Paris. At this time, they might even have had lunch already to sync the visits, which is awfully important. Now, if I come to your question, President Macron is low-key, nuanced, wants to hold out several sides of the coin, and sometimes I would add may get lost between those different sides of the same coin. He also has to practice two different roles. One, of course, is as a European, but the other one is somebody who represents France's economic interests in the bilateral relationships with China, and that is still in competition with others within Europe. So we're probably going to see a visit with a large business delegation with people who are going to try and demonstrate that there can still be a civil society relationship with China, for whatever it's worth in today's Xi Jinping's new normal era. Many people comment what Macron says by saying he's for a third way. And what is true is that he often emphasizes the Sino-American rivalry, implicitly distancing himself and France from it. He never uses himself publicly, at least, the term third way. And another feature of French policy is important to note is that he has been supporting in Brussels literally all the defensive measures that have been listed again, by the way, by Mrs. von der Leyen in her speech. I'm waiting to see what happens with the last defensive measure which she announced, which is about outward investment screening. In other words, screening European investment to China, which is something she said the EU would now work on. So we have a double act by Macron, which is not going to be very easy. And on top of that, clearly, something which the Chinese could easily do without, which is talking about Ukraine. Ambassador Fu Zong to the EU had the gall in early March to say that the Ukraine issue should be put outside the bilateral relationship when Ukraine is clearly in Europe. This is a war on European soil. And we know what Xi Jinping has just said and done in Moscow. That's going to be the most difficult part in Beijing. I think what's really important is that the two leaders keep demonstrating during the visit that there is practical agreement on a number of key points regarding the economy and regarding the stand on Ukraine.
Thank you for those comments. Colleen, I'd like to come over to you and sort of shift east a little bit and talk about how Beijing is looking at this visit and how it views its relationship both with Europe and with individual European countries. Not every country is on the same page in terms of what Europe's relationship with China looks like. So how would you say Beijing looks at this, and where would you say relations with EU fit into China's and President Xi's general foreign policy approach?
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you for the chance to serve on this panel as well. So I guess starting out, I think in terms of how Xi is viewing the visit, I think there's a couple of advantages he's going to look to take when this visit is happening. First of all, it offers him a chance to continue to play international statesman and to demonstrate to a domestic audience and to a global audience that world leaders, 3 European leaders in the course of a week, are coming to him to solve global challenges. This is part of his strategic vision for China to assume its rightful global leadership role, part of Xi's effort to remake the world order to pave the way for China's continued rise. And it comes on the heels of other high-level meetings where Xi has tried to play its statesman role. The meetings with Putin that we'll come to later, the brokering he had of the Iran-Saudi diplomatic ties resuming. And it also comes on the heels of some major international events that China has hosted just in the last week. Most notably, it had the Global Development Forum where some CEOs from Apple, Allianz, Rio Tinto were there, signaling China is back open to the world. And so I think Xi wants to use this visit to again emphasize these points. And then secondarily, I think this is a chance for Xi to continue to sort of try to shore up ties with the Europeans. He's recognizing there's some signals coming out of Brussels and elsewhere that there is a harder stance at play towards China. He has to have seen the speech from von der Leyen as a signal of closer alignment towards the US's position on many of these things, even if von der Leyen wasn't calling out the US specifically. And so he's looking for these meetings to sort of behind closed doors encourage Europeans to not take the strong economic actions in alignment with the US as he is looking to avoid. I think he is bracing for these conversations about Ukraine behind closed doors. I think publicly looking to really minimize that as an issue that comes up. Maybe he's just seeking for these leaders to talk about China's role as a international mediator. That would be kind of a best case outcome for Xi publicly. Just in terms of the overall the overall relationship between China and the EU from the China optic, this relationship, Xi really sees this relationship through the prism of his great power competition with the US, and that the EU, at a minimum, Chinese leaders see the EU as a group that can be not following suit with US actions, whether they do this kind of collectively or on an individual basis. And at its best, I think the Chinese hope to see the EU as a counterweight, this third way that Francois presented as well. And so for the Chinese, this is a relationship that it sees as a way to advance its own interests while not making sure that it doesn't have kind of this aligned Western view that's hampering what it views as its rightful rise in the global system.
It's really interesting. Reinhard, I might come to you to pick up on something that Colleen said. You mentioned that China sees the European Union through this prism of its competition with the US, which sort of in a way means that the EU is caught between this broader competition for global influence between the United States and China. Reinhard, does the EU see itself in that role? Like, does it feel as though it's being squeezed between China and the United States? I mean, if there's one thing in Washington these days that can unite very polarized political parties, it's China hawkishness. So I'd be curious as to how the EU is sort of thinking about its role here.
As far as I can see, there are, of course, a few voices from Europe that would indeed paint the picture of a hegemonic rivalry between the US and China. But that's not the prevailing view. And indeed, from the Chinese side, the attitude has always been, over the last decade or so, that they try to drive a wedge between the EU and the US because they understand that their main target is to win this rivalry with the US. And unfortunately, over recent month or the recent period of time, increasingly, we've also heard from Washington that this is all about a rivalry between Washington and China. And I think that's a very narrow view. I don't share that. We don't share that in Europe. We have, for instance, said already in 2019 that we consider ourselves in a systemic rivalry with China. That does not mean we're somewhere squeezed between two alien powers, but that we are in a camp that clearly opposes the systemic challenges that arise from China. And I believe that the fact that von der Leyen in her speech highlighted also that we are, as Europeans, trying to align better with other partners, third countries like Japan, Australia, Canada, and many others, was meant to underscore the argument that this is not just a game between two major players where everybody else is basically put in their place to wait and be told, but that we as Europeans hold on to the multilateral approach, that we don't want to allow this to degenerate into a big power struggle between just a few big powers. I believe that it would be very helpful if Washington would avoid language that seems to coincide with the language that we've heard from Beijing all the time, that this is just about two big powers.
Yeah, that would be nice. It seems like that's where we're heading. Francois and Colleen, I have another question that I sort of want both of you to hop in on here. If you look at last week's address, and this sort of builds on Reinhard's comments as well, von der Leyen outlined a list of international partners necessary for EU cooperation in the face of China's strategic challenges. The United States was notably omitted from that list. So where does EU cooperation sort of fit within the US government's outlook on China, Colleen? And Francois, are there concerns about Europe, going it alone? I mean, who else are they looking at in terms of partners here? Is it the global South? So I'll start with you on that, and then Colleen, come to you.
Thanks. I think in the von der Leyen speech, the US has an implicit presence throughout the speech, but it's important before she goes to Beijing to emphasize to Beijing that the conclusions she has arrived at are European, and that our partnership is not only with the US, which is why she lists several groupings, G7, G20, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few and some others. That's very important. India also, and she mentioned the Trade and Technology Council with India. She doesn't mention the Trade and Technology Council with the US, which is very active, actually. So I would think it's a guess that von der Leyen is also answering the implicit criticism that the Commission actually has a lot of negotiation and stuff going with Washington that's not necessarily being made very public. That's the TTC, and she wants to dispel the impression to Beijing that it's a kind of transatlantic plot. It's a way of presenting things. I would say other things, especially on the French side, about the fear of Europeans to pick up the tab of policies that are designed in Washington. That's clearly there, but it's another issue.
Colleen, over to you.
Thank you. I agree with Francois that I think the omission is partly intended at that Chinese audience to ahead of the visit demonstrate kind of autonomy, especially if von der Leyen is trying to get, maybe in private meetings, get some movement out of Xi on the Ukraine issue. But I think if you look at the language in that speech and pair that with the joint statement that she had made with President Biden just a couple of weeks earlier in March, it echoes a lot of the same themes, kind of countering acts of economic coercion, non-market policies and practices. There's a reference in the speech she made with Biden about preventing US and EU companies, capital and knowledge from fueling technological advances in our strategic rivals, which is essentially aimed at the Chinese MilSiv fusion practices. So I think there's a lot, without saying the US, I think she is, the policies she laid out are the ones that she and Biden also jointly laid out a couple of weeks earlier. In terms of the kind of the role of EU cooperation in the US-China policy world, I think that the three tenets as laid out by Blinken last year, invest, align, compete, which I think also align with some of the points that von der Leyen laid out, that align part is a core part of that, together with US allies in the Indo-Pacific through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Quad. But I think these are both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific are both key partners and key groupings that the US sees as part of this effort, and not just to compete with China kind of at a strategic level, but even at a very narrow kind of concrete level. I think there is a lot happening that's below the headlines that I think is worth both sides highlighting that work that they're doing. To take one example, in the recent US and EU Trade and Technology Council meeting from December, both sides announced some joint cooperation they have on third-party countries trying to finance the build out of secure telecom networks in Jamaica and I think it was Kenya. But just there's some very concrete work that they can build on that doesn't have to be this sort of strategic high-level work, but it's about trying to offer alternatives together to what the Chinese are offering that I think that form the basis of some of this work.
It's interesting. So Reinhard, I want to come to you with a Germany-specific question, if that's all right. Chancellor Scholz was under a lot of pressure last November when he visited Beijing, when he came with a German business delegation in tow. This was around the time that they agreed to let Chinese shipping giant Costco acquire a stake in one of the terminals at the port of Hamburg. There's been a lot of discussion about the relationship between Germany and China, if Volkswagen's relationship with China as an export market. Can you give us a sense of how Germany is viewing its relationship with China? We're expecting a China strategy in the coming months here, I think, if we're lucky. What should we be looking for? What should we expect from that?
Well, that's a question that probably very few people around Berlin would dare answering with confidence yet, because I would say the German position vis-a-vis China has been in a transformative process ever since we started forming this new coalition. clearly in the coalition contract, there were some fundamental statements that showed that we wanted to take a different approach from the preceding governments under the leadership of Chancellor Merkel. For instance, by recognizing Taiwan and the need to show solidarity with Taiwan's democracy, which is a statement that German China policy has never made publicly before. But there are reluctancies. There are not only in the political sphere, but also among major multinationals, there are efforts to push back against a real change in the policy. I believe that in the end, we will still get a result that will be more European and less Germany-centric than we have seen in the past. Certainly the visit by the Chancellor was not a testament to that, but I believe that increasingly, and that is also supported, interestingly, by the conservative opposition in the Bundestag. Increasingly, Germany will understand that it does not own a spoon long enough to eat from the same bowl with the Chinese on its own. We have to use this common European spoon to be successful and not go hungry. That is going to happen. I also believe that this de-risking philosophy will be supported by the new China strategy that will come out over the next couple of months. The shift is supported, and that is important, by the experience of a large part of the German business community. The voices you hear are the voices of Volkswagen or Daimler or Siemens, but the voices you do not hear, the voices from the Mittelstand, the small and medium-sized companies, they speak a different language and they express a different experience, and they're less prone to go for a more investment in China is a better perspective approach. They have been reluctant to continue investing. They have been more willing to diversify. So it's a process of transformation. But if you look at the most recent example of our trade defense instruments, the anti-coercion instrument, you will find that Germany played a very positive role in getting that done. So I think we're on a positive track.
I think so too. Thank you. So shifting a little bit more towards the East, she recently had a visit to Moscow where he met with Putin. Putin, as he was arriving, said, welcome to my good friend, my old friend. And the visit very much seemed to solidify this partnership. They made sure not to say it was an alliance, but this partnership, potential partnership of no limits between China and Russia. So I'd like to come to Francois and Colleen to kind of give us a sense of what they were watching during this visit. What do you think China's aims are in its relationship with Russia? And what do you think China has to gain by aligning closer with Russia? I mean, when you look at the way that both of these two countries derive power from the international system, it seems as though Russia uses its ability to create chaos and drive wedges between allies, and China seems to gain its power through its influence and stability of the international system. And so what do you think China has to gain by aligning closer with Russia at a time where the latter is increasingly isolated from the rest of the world? Francois, I'll come to you first, and then Colleen, I'll go to you.
It's a very good question to ask. What in the name of God does China, which emphasizes, co-prosperity and stability, have to do with this troublemaker whose GDP, Russia's GDP, is roughly equivalent to that of Spain? But there are other considerations, and I think a main defect in our perspective is that we think in economic rational terms. They think in political and ideological terms. First, Russia is still China's number one strategic relationship officially. The US is China's number one relationship without the word strategic, also officially. That defines the polarities. Europe is not. And it's very striking that in the past few years, for example, China has lost several members of the so-called 16+1 or 17+1 grouping with Central and Eastern European countries. The Baltic countries just went, they left. Poland is not very keen on the dialogue right now. So it tells you volumes about what does Putin attach importance to. It's likely he currently attaches more importance to his relations with Belarus than with a lot of Eastern European countries. It's ideology first, it's strategy first, it's public diplomacy first, and there the UN matter, the so-called global south. China doesn't use the expression, but in practice wants to be seen as at the helm of a kind of international group that involves everybody but the Western countries. That is very important. This being said, we may want to look beyond the rhetorics of Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow, although he did everything he could to prove that he was standing pat on his ideas, and the parting remarks public as he was going to his car to Putin saying, we're now witnessing changes the like of which we haven't seen in 100 years, and we are driving these changes together. That's a very strong general expression. Of course, it's still possible that China doesn't cross some red lines. And this is, of course, what Macron and von der Leyen are going to try to persuade them not to do, not to upgrade, for example, semiconductor deliveries or arms deliveries to Russia, perhaps to be a little clearer on the nuclear threats and blustering that Putin almost constantly uses, and perhaps try to make Mr. Putin have a somewhat more balanced position by at least talking to Ukraine. There have been almost no official contacts, 2 meetings between foreign affairs minister on the margin of international meetings. I think the Ukrainian minister had the opportunity to print an article once in the Chinese press. That was all, against the deluge of propaganda in favor of Russia. It's clear that this is very important in China's strategy, and we would be very wrong if we think that it's just an optical show that China is cynical. Of course, it's cynical generally, but what Russia is doing now is useful, and the cost, which is more difficult relations with Europe, but not impossible, as Reinhard has said. Most Europeans don't want to decouple, for example, so we are going to be tied, as the US is, by the way. Secretary of Commerce Raimondo in the US, I like to cite that, also said that the US was not about decoupling with China. So they are acting with a kind of safety net, which we provide ourselves, all of us.
Thank you. Colleen, over to you.
I agree with a lot of what Francois said in terms of the sort of the strategic advantages they each see, and then I guess in a more macro picture, kind of how they're presenting an alternative, way of doing business, an alternative way of operating from these Western hegemons that they hope will resonate in parts of the global South that are maybe a little more receptive to those messages. I think there's also some practical aspects to their relationship that benefit the Chinese. The first one, as you alluded to, Russia being this agent of chaos, but the longer the world's focus can be drawn and remain in Ukraine, and the US is drawn into that, the less you'll see of a focus and the less US involvement in the Indo-Pacific, which is something that is to the Chinese advantage as they continue. They've long done some of the reclamation work there, some of the other work that they have kind of behind the scenes or below the surface. The longer the U.S. is drawn and stays in Europe, the less it's in China's backyard. And I think also, from a practical perspective, there's a real interest in China of making sure that the Putin regime doesn't topple and either a more China unfriendly regime is in place, or there's just frankly like widespread instability within Russia. The two countries share a 4,000-kilometer border that right now China doesn't have to worry about as well at all, so they can be focused on the border with India, the border to the east. And so that stability on such a large swath of China's land, I think, is a really key point. And should there be some conflict related to Taiwan or elsewhere, having Russia as a partner, if there's blockades in the east, that over land, maintaining those land links will provide China with access to energy, food, kind of all the parts that would be needed for sustaining the population there.
I may ask you a quick follow-up question. I mean, we've seen China recently try to play more, maybe as a diplomatic partner to some countries. I mean, look at the role that it played, for example, in the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Do you think that China, and this is to Colleen to sort of follow up on, do you think China is looking at the war in Ukraine as, you mentioned a distraction, we're not really in their backyard? Are they using this opportunity to become more of an indispensable player to some countries, to pull them away from perhaps Europe and the United States and to the East?
I think China would like to use, it would like to portray itself as an indispensable global power, kind of, however, it's opportunistic in the ways that it takes advantage of this. I think the Chinese themselves were probably a bit surprised at the breakthrough that they were able to broker with Saudi and Iran. I think they would like to build on that work and use that to increase, their influence in the Middle East and elsewhere. But I think that's not necessarily something they're looking to replicate in Ukraine. I think the peace plan proposal there for Ukraine was more about deflecting Western criticism that China is aiding Putin's war machine than it was about a general, an actual path forward on peace. So I think the Chinese are kind of feeling out what this mediator role might look like and where it could have actual implications and practicality, and where it can't. The Chinese have also mooted various peace plan type proposals related to the Arab-Israeli conflict that are really sort of non-starters. They're just not a lot of applicable applications. So this may have been a little more of the exception to the norm in the recent breakthrough, but certainly something they would like to see, being able to build on.
Thanks. Reinhard, I want to come back to you. This is an audience question, and it's something that we sort of touched on at the beginning. What are some of the challenges for the EU to implement some of these more technical measures toward economic security that von der Leyen referenced in her strategy? I'm talking specifically about this joint investment screening mechanism or anti-coercion instruments. What are the challenges to implementing those?
Well, when we first started working on trade defense instruments, that was by no means a universally shared priority. In the beginning, when we started discussing whether we should have a special anti-dumping mechanism in 2016, it took a while until the Commission came around to that. And the investment screening mechanism that we then dealt with was, in the beginning, supported only by a minority of member states, because only 11 of all the member states had their own investment screening. That has changed. And there used to be a division, for instance, over the international procurement instrument. It was delayed for almost 10 years because of German opposition. That has changed also. There is one concern that many member states will always have. They don't want Brussels to they don't want to allow what they call a Brussels power grab in implementing these policies. So we have to walk a fine line of coming together for common action without interfering with national prerogatives. We've done that quite successfully, I would say, and we're now on the verge of taking the next step. So Commission has promised they will propose amending legislation for the investment screening, and they will also include, as Francois has mentioned before, outbound investment screening. This will again be a very very intense conversation as ACI was. ACI was not the anti-coercion instrument was not universally supported. The Swedish presidency would have preferred not to have it, but we succeeded in finding a common way forward. So the challenges are getting smaller, I would say. The usefulness of working together is more convincing today than it was a couple of years ago. But of course, in the end, the practicalities will be at stake when national interests diverge. We saw that when we had this coercive Chinese pressure on Lithuania. A lot of European countries were reluctant to support Lithuania at the beginning, because many felt that Lithuania had gone it alone and now they were asking for support. But then the Chinese helped out by taking measures that confronted the very principle of the common market, of the single market, which is in a way the holy grail of the whole European Union. So then they helped us aligning with each other, and I would say that they can be relied upon to a huge degree to help us overcome some tensions that will always be there, because not all the national interests are immediately on the same page.
Thank you. We have actually a bunch of audience questions here. One thing we haven't talked about quite yet is, and I think it's probably worth discussing, is Taiwan, and whether Europe, or how Europe would respond to a Taiwan scenario, like a naval blockade or something along those lines. Do you think it would respond with anything over and beyond rhetoric? Francois, maybe I'll ask you. I'll give you the easy question.
Sure, really easy.
Yeah.
Look, this is the area where Europe is clearly in hesitation. It's in hesitation, of course, because the actual hard power is missing. If you look at the Western Pacific and the Taiwan Straits, it's in the hands of the US and, of course, of China from another perspectives, or in the hand of allies of the US who are shoring up their defense currently. And that's one result of Xi Jinping's policy and of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But for Europeans, I think you have to look at different strands. I think the European Parliament, of which Reinhard is a distinguished member, is way ahead in terms of increasing the profile of the Taiwan issue and pointing attention to it, and explaining that this is a democracy and that therefore we need, and also an important one because of the technological and economic stakes, and therefore we need one way or another to upgrade relations, which doesn't mean deviating from the one China policy, but at times it may look so to the Chinese. And we have a much more cautious Commission, which may represent a shared view of European governments, which is risk avoidance. So just very recently, in the past few weeks, the Commission has said forget about a bilateral investment treaty with Taiwan. That's the other side, of course, of the coin with CAI. CAI may not be happening, as Mrs. von der Leyen implied in her speech, but neither will the European Commission adopt a high-profile policy towards Taiwan. Everybody wants to treat it, and I think the companies in Europe are obsessed with the risks that a conflict, both the conflict itself, whether it's a blockade or whether it's a war, and the sanction process would bring to their business and to the logistics chain for Europe as well as for America. But on this issue, I think the bulk of Europe is still on the side of caution. I note, though, that if I take my country as an example, if I take France, Taiwan was almost unmentionable in official pronouncement, especially at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's quite pronounceable now. The issue has gained some prominency. I think we're all deadly afraid of what some call a two-front war, where Xi Jinping would think that the occasion is ripe to make a move on Taiwan, whatever the move is.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel, can I come in here too?
Please.
I would first of all warn ourselves against just focusing on the so-called Taiwan scenario. As Kevin Rudd has expressed several times, and I would agree with him, there could be a chance of avoiding the Taiwan scenario if we come up with a pertinent and of course with a widely shared policy that can deter China from going there. At the moment, and there I agree with Francois, Europe is not prepared, and we're not even talking about deterrence in that context. But I believe that we will have to up our game. And deterrence is not only playing out in the realm of military prowess, but also in the political and in the economic field. And the need to put Taiwan on the radar screen has certainly been widely accepted in Europe over the last, I would say, 4 years or 3 years. There has been a sea change as regards attention, and it's not just the European Parliament that is a leader there. National parliaments are also playing an increasingly positive role. Just recently, a German minister visited Taiwan. That was the first time in 25 years that such a high-ranking official would visit the island. I think that the reluctancy is certainly there, as Francois said, but the reluctancy could be made more powerful if we just resigned ourselves to discussing when is the PLA going to act and what are we going to do once they act, and refrain from thinking about what we can do to prevent them from going there. If Xi Jinping every 1st of January comes to the conclusion, maybe not this year because the cost would be too high, that would be an achievement that we can attain.
Well, to follow up on one thing that you said, and it builds on an audience question as well. You mentioned that Europe coming up with a widely shared policy that can deter, but they're not really prepared in that sense yet. If there's something less than a uniform European consensus on how to address China, and I'm not just talking about the Taiwan scenario now, I'm talking about sort of writ large, do you think this opens further opportunity for the CCP to advance its own interests in Europe? Like, is that something that we need to be worried about, Reinhard?
Every internal division that we have can be exploited, and the Chinese are good at trying to do that. but they have not been very successful lately. Francois mentioned the example of the 17 or 16 plus 1. That was dreaded a lot when the Chinese first succeeded in pulling that off. And today, nobody's giving a damn for it. Nobody believes that this will be a successful attempt to divide and conquer Europe. Similarly, Germany has played a very special role, has been an outlier in a way during the days of Angela Merkel. And Germany is now moving closer to the shared position of the European Union. Yes, they try to take advantage of divisions, but no, they're not very successful because the underlying developments are unifying. This is not something that they can just reinterpret at will. We're seeing the realities, and that unites us.
Thank you. So we have less than 10 minutes left. And so I think it'd probably be a good idea to, allow the panelists to give some closing remarks, but I want to frame it through the discussion that we're having on a strategic outlook, the EU strategic outlook on China. But also, what do you think China's strategic outlook is on the West? What are its ambitions? What are we missing here? What do we need to be thinking about going forward? So sort of those two questions together, our strategic outlook towards China and their strategic outlook towards us. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on. Colleen, maybe I'll start with you and then I'll go to Francois and then close with Reinhard.
Thanks. Well, those are challenging. Those could be hour-long discussions in and of themselves. But I think, I guess, starting with the U.S., the West's, and really this is kind of the broader developed country, kind of the like-minded countries. You have the Japans and the Koreas, the Australias. I think that there is a broader coalition of countries that probably should be part of this conversation and thinking. But I think it is. I think incumbent on this group as they move forward, to really look at putting kind of the meat on the bones of some of the policies and high level pronouncements on what it means to better compete with China, and what it looks like to actually align policies or actually implement some of these things we've talked about to de-risk, to reduce reliance on China. Some parts of the U.S. is talking about, selective decoupling. But to take one example, that there's this oft-mentioned term of friendshoring. But what does that actually look like in reality? What are the programs and the policies that would support it? There are very complex, in some cases, very fast-moving industries. You're trying to align these policies in. So I think having smart mechanisms in place, whether it's, more formal kind of investment spin-offs of groups like the Quad, or taking parts of the TTC that are working well and kind of spinning off, bringing in the private sector on some of these conversations, but putting actual kind of practical policies to beneath these high-level pronouncements, I think is a key next step for the West. And in terms of, I think, China's strategic outlook, I think the next year, in terms of how the Chinese are looking at maintaining some sort of, there's been lots of talk about having kind of guardrails in the US-China relationship, multiple, kind of events that spun more out of control, like the balloon incident, than I think either side maybe would have anticipated initially. But trying to bring some level of stability to China's ties with the US and to the West, not necessarily, going back to maybe regular dialogues about cooperation, but I think something resembling guardrails or something that, can be a step in for kind of a crisis management position. And then that being said, I think China's more going into the offense when it's looking at its relations with the global South. So trying to court some of these individual countries as again, trying to reframe how the countries receive Chinese investment get the countries, leaders from those countries to kind of buy into what China has to offer, amplify China's messaging with their own domestic audiences and globally, taking advantage of UN groups that favor China's, global development initiatives. There's the Friends of the GDI in the UN. So I think trying to advance some of these efforts and have them gain traction over the next year will be key.
Yeah, you're right. And it's interesting that you mentioned the Chinese spy balloon. If we had this conversation 6 weeks ago, the whole event would have just been a spy balloon event. So gives you a sense of where Washington and the US is. Francois, over to you.
Thank you. And I will answer your call to speak in more general terms. Public opinion in Europe. Well, the most unfavorable countries are about 85 or to 90% unfavorable to China. The ones who would remain the most favorable still have a 2/3 majority who has a negative view of China. It tells you something about how things have moved. On the other hand, from Beijing, public opinion doesn't exist. It's fickle. Democracies can be moved. They can change. Public opinion can hover from one extreme to another. It's Beijing's job to divide Europeans among each other, and they do it when they can. The most important division, by the way, is not so much between member states, but by sort of shunning the EU itself, the European institutions at times, paying scant attention and reserving relationships for the member states. That's the most important part of Beijing's tactics. What's even more important is, of course, dividing the EU from the US, but there, the US has a role and a responsibility. I think we have two issues which are currently, on the front burner between the EU and the US. One is the Inflation Reduction Act, the energy transition measures, what is viewed in Europe as pretty much of a pro-US business initiative with huge subsidies. And it's really important in that context to give a meaning to something that Reynard said, friendshoring, being larger than just the domestic US interest, even if one understands the electoral stakes. By the way, speaking of electoral stakes, if there is something that's nagging European leaders that is the back of their mind, what happens in 2024? That's where Xi Jinping and even Putin can count on some European hesitations. But what if a leader emerges in the US who negates the policies that have been going on under Joe Biden? We just don't know. We can't be sure. And this is important. The second issue, which I think is going to be important, it's implicit in von der Leyen's speech because she mentions AI, quantum, and others, is the digital technologies on which we do have an asymmetry, different interests, different group. We're more about rules, you're more about companies, you are indeed more advanced. But it's hugely important that we build a kind of common space that is able to resist the authoritarian axis that's being formed by China with Russia and others in the digital space. This is the future of our societies. It's also the future of the battle on public influence. And it's very important that we see more or less eye to eye, or that we're able to make compromises over these issues.
Thank you. Reinhard, I'll pass it over to you for the close.
Thank you. I'm not sure Xi Jinping is really convinced that time is on China's side. What we hear from him is contradictory. He talks about the changes unseen in 100 years, and then he also talks about the huge challenges that China will have to confront. I believe a lot will depend on how we address these issues. If we go from a point of view where we want to defend the past, where we were not troubled by China's rise, I think we're probably destined to lose vis-a-vis China. China is trying to paint us into that corner. When they say that we are demonstrating a Cold War policy, they want to identify us with an unpleasant past. Whereas when she says in Moscow that he wants to create a modern global order, he tries to identify China with a future. And the question is, are we in competition with China for a better future, or are we just defending the status quo ante? I think in the latter case, he may still have great chances. But if we understand that we have to make a better offer to countries from the global south than China does, we can be more than competitive. Look at the global infrastructure investment. BRI has not been overly successful recently, nor has, however, been our own answer to that. Global Gateway is just getting started. Where are our efforts to really make develop a policy that aligns us as regards, for instance, also climate change issues, aligns our own efforts with those of the countries of the global south? If we neglect that dimension, if we just address China challenges as if we were playing just within a triangle between the US and Europe and China, I think we're missing at least half of the reality, and we should not do that.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I appreciate our panelists, Reinhard, Colleen, and Francois, for joining us today and taking time out of their busy schedules to talk about this issue, which I think will only grow in importance. And I'm sure we'll have many more discussions of this sort at the Atlantic Council. So for everyone tuning in, stay tuned on that front. And thank you all for joining, and we will see you next time.